now, for a session presented by Medallia, please welcome the Global Head of Hospitality, Travel, and Leisure at Medallia, Geoffrey Ryskamp, and Professor at the Cornell School of Hotel Administration, Chris Anderson, in conversation with Skift Vice President, Kat Townsend.
Hello, good morning, Chris and Jeff. Thank you both so much for being here today. We're here today, obviously, talking about loyalty and consumer engagement. There's been some new research out of the Cornell Center for Hospitality that suggests that post-stay engagement, for example, through email messaging like surveys or requests for reviews, especially when sent from a manager, can increase direct booking tendencies, which signals an opportunity for brands to nurture a specific type of loyalty. So let's dive right in. Chris, you authored the research. Can you just tell us a little bit about the research and kind of what the data is telling us about loyalty? And then perhaps start just by defining the response bias that we typically see in these types of engagements and some of the challenges around customer feedback. And we actually have some slides to queue up here as well.
All right, yeah, thanks, Kat. It's my pleasure to join Skift and Jeff with Medallia here today and just go through a few talking points here, right? So as you sort of mentioned, we're all sort of, deeply aware of the impact of reviews upon customer choice and our space, right? But one of these issues that underlines some problems with that is response bias. Right. And by that, we mean not everyone is going to post a review to TripAdvisor or to Google. Right. And so, my research has shown that basically unsatisfied guests are about 2 times as likely to post a review as satisfied guests. Right. So that really means we need to sort of make this review posting process easier for consumers in order to reduce that non-response bias. And one of the classic ways we've looked at that is a sort of post-stay guest satisfaction survey, where now the consumer is getting that email or text, that correspondence post-stay, and then that facilitates not just feedback to the property, but actually the feedback to post those reviews to Google or to TripAdvisor, right? And one of the side benefits now of this guest satisfaction survey is that now we've started this private communication between the guest and the property. And that private communication can then have not just feedback to TripAdvisor, but can also have private responses from management back to that guest. And it's some of that private response that really sort of drives this engagement, right? So here on our next slide, we can sort of see some of the impact of that sort of private managerial engagement with the customer. Right. So it kind of has, I'm sort of looking at sort of 2 facets of this, right? So this was through a 3-year study that we did jointly with Medallia, where we looked at about 500 plus hotels, and we looked at those sort of longitudinal engagements between the guest and the property. And we looked at sort of engagement today and then how that drives future behaviors, right? That future behavior might be satisfaction, right? So how does managerial engagement drive satisfaction? And then the second stage of that is how does it impact their propensity to post reviews either to Google or TripAdvisor, right? So we're looking at these sort of making them happier and then making them share that opinion with others, right? So really kind of drive that engagement.
Makes a ton of sense. So kind of like these post-stay engagements are just the missing link between a guest's initial stay and repeat booking. And the more you can get them to post reviews, the more engagement they'll have with your brand. So I want to bring in Jeff, who is with Medallia, and they specifically handle these types of strategies. So Jeff, what are some examples? And can you just kind of talk us through the difference between direct feedback versus social feedback?
Yeah, Kat, great question. So at Medallia, we really look at customer experience in kind of two macro ways. One is observed experience, and that is everybody who's not providing feedback, who you're monitoring their activities, their habits, et cetera. That's a key part of customer experience. We're not going to go into that today because it's not as directly related to the research at hand, but that gets us to the world of feedback, both direct feedback and also always on feedback. Now, within that, social feedback is particularly compelling because it not only speaks to somebody's experience that they had, especially when you're talking to a customer who actually stayed rather than, perhaps the world of organic, but it also has an influence on future stay behaviors and booking habits as well. We've seen this time and time again across the hospitality and retail space where we work. So this is the thing that I think is of most interest to the hospitality clients we work with today. This idea of the between stay experience, which for a long time companies were trying to chip away at and try to understand how to keep customers engaged between stay. This is one way. The social review process is one of the better, more effective ways of bringing people back in and having confidence with booking with a brand.
Makes a ton of sense. And I think what is especially interesting is just the idea of the managerial response. And it kind of facilitates a specific type of loyalty. So I want to bring the slides back up. I think we have a slide on the different types of loyalty that can be curated and created. And I want to bring Chris in to tell us a little bit about the difference between cognitive loyalty and affective loyalty, and help us understand why managers play such a critical role.
So I think really it's one of those key things that sort of Jeff mentioned there, talking about sort of that connection in between the stays, right? So we're all sort of fully aware of how we engage with the customer on property and how that drives a connection to the brand or to the property. But how do we take that one step further and sort of have this between stay engagement, right? And that helps build this emotional connection to the brand, right? And that's sort of why we think about loyalty from sort of these two facets, right? One is like the sort of physical or cognitive aspect of loyalty. And that's really the points or miles that we're sort of familiar with, where now I'm sort of loyal to the brand, and that's, chipping away and building sort of free stays down the road, or maybe upgrades, that sort of element. The other part of sort of loyalty is this affective or emotional part, right? And this is probably more important than that physical aspect, because it's this intangible part of loyalty, where now the customer is sort of building these connections with the property or with the brand. And what we sort of see is that this affective or emotional loyalty is really tied to this engagement. And once we can sort of drive that affective loyalty, then that has some pretty profound impacts on consumers' behaviors in the future. And what I look at is their booking channel choice, right? Are they looking to book direct, or are they going to go intermediated, right? And there's sort of two elements to this feedback. If I can get them engaged through a guest satisfaction survey and get them to provide feedback, that alone in itself sort of, moves them from intermediate channels to direct channels down the road. And then if I can sort of further amplify that by having managerial engagement after that feedback, then that sort of just amplifies that sort of affective or emotional tie to the property. And so these have sort of pretty profound impacts on their channel choice. And then that channel choice obviously drives sort of savings in acquisition costs.
And Jeff, some of the metrics we typically use to measure loyalty are things like customer retention or share of wallet. When we think about channel choice as something that signals loyalty, on the slide we had up, we saw that response could yield a 1% to 2% incremental savings. Can you just contextualize that for us, and then also tell us a little bit more about customer behavior, kind of especially with channel choice signaling loyalty?
Yeah, these cost saving numbers, to put them in context, if you're looking at 1% to 2%, that's tens, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. It's really, really powerful stuff for brands that do this well. And we see it happening live, within our customer experience cloud that we administer for most of the hotel industry. So it's really powerful to see. And to me, it's exciting to see brands do things that their customers want them to do, kind of doing the right thing anyhow, very much the nature of hospitality, as I learned when I was in hotel school, learning from folks like Chris. But I think the thing that we've learned as an industry over the last, maybe like 15 years, we don't pick the channel as brands. Customers pick the channel. They always pick the channel of interaction that they choose to interact. TripAdvisor had taught us, I know TripAdvisor was on earlier, all of a sudden TripAdvisor popped up, and that was something customers loved engaging with. Obviously Twitter as well. And these signals and these channels are things that companies need to pay attention to. A recent Harris poll that just came out a couple weeks ago said that over 3/4 of customers are willing to buy more after a positive experience with a brand on social, and increase their spending with a brand as well, over the competition. So really here, prioritization, I think, is important. And the brands that do this the best, that really realize that cost savings that Chris mentioned in his research, are those that understand the importance of prioritizing social interactions. Look, there are many, many different social channels of interaction. What you have to do as a brand is understand where your traffic is coming from. So kind of more on the booking funnel side, and also understand the cost side of things and know where you want to go, and then prioritize your efforts in those areas where customers are interacting with you, and also make the most sense for your customers from a buying decision process.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, two things really struck me when I was reading the research. One was just that this actually happened to me. Back in December, I stayed at the Kimpton Palomar here in Miami Beach, and I had a wonderful stay, but I just didn't have the time to write a review. It's not something that I would typically do, to the point about response bias, unless something went horribly wrong. And so I didn't write a review, but then a couple months later, February, March, I received an email from somebody who was purportedly the manager asking me to write a review. And they sent a simple link that clicked out to TripAdvisor. And I thought, you know what, I had a lovely stay. And this human being is asking me to do them a favor. They accommodated me. I should accommodate their ask. So I went ahead and wrote a review, and it was simple enough, but I think it's indicative of the fact that this kind of thing is working. And the other thing that struck me was that feedback, either positive or negative, by guests signals a willingness to engage with the brand, and that increases the probability of them becoming loyal by almost 50%. So even if somebody has a not positive interaction with your brand, you can sway that into them becoming loyal by just interacting with them privately. But I wanna get some kind of like key takeaways, starting with Chris. I think, I would love to understand, what are some similar strategies that brands and hotels can implement now, similar to what, the Kimpton Palomar has done?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kat. It's really, it's kind of like this cycle, right? And you want to sort of engage that cycle as much as you can, right? So we know that reviews and social content, is impacting that purchasing power, right? And at the same time, how do I make sure that responses are representative of those consumers? And that's where these post-stay interactions can facilitate that. And, that is like that first part you talked about, is that you really want the opinion of your consumers, right? You're telling them that, right? Then this sort of post-stay engagement on the manager back to the customer is like, I'm listening, right? So now you're sort of reinforcing, share your opinion. I'm responding to you. And it could be just a quick thank you. Now I'm listening. And that sort of completes this cycle that then, creates this emotional tie, drives that loyalty, impacts channel choice, right? And facilitates this feedback throughout this process.
Mm-hmm. And Jeff, we have some audience questions, but I also want to ask you, what are some strategies that brands could implement now, just for, quick hit?
Yeah, I think the thing that's incredible about this is that the local coffee shop down the street with no technology probably does this better than a lot of brands do at scale. But we've actually seen many of the companies we work with kind of cross the Rubicon. They have more customer data. They're able to actually leverage all of that to approach their customers in more personal and meaningful ways. And that creates this cycle that Chris really references here. From a feedback standpoint, I think the most important thing is this is not about asking for favors. This is about involving the customer in the experience. And without any type of prompting, we see response rates anywhere from 25 to 50% in hospitality with just a basic email, survey. And obviously messaging is a big one that a lot of brands have moved to by now, and other channels across digital, et cetera. But if you say things like, hey, we learned these things from our customers, and because of that, we implemented this change to our breakfast experience or this change to our pool experience based on customer feedback, that makes the customer feel a lot better, just like you did with, when you were staying with Kimpton, who obviously a great Medallia client that we are proud to work with.
Yeah. I think one of the key elements here is that sort of Jeff is talking about is that, consumers want to be engaged, but they don't want to waste their time, right? And so they want the path that's of least resistance, right? So if you facilitate it, then it's easy for them. And also if it's coming from you, then they know that's more apt to get some sort of interaction from the property, right? And so that's why the sort of response is critical, as well as just sort of the looking for that behavior, right? So it's kind of these two elements, right? So path of least resistance, but also don't waste my time, right? And so that's what this engagement is talking about, is that there's this affirmation that really we're listening to what you had to say.
Absolutely. And speaking of time, we are unfortunately out of it. I want to thank you both so much for chatting with us today. For folks who are interested in getting the research, please go to Showcase in the left side of your screen, click on Medallia, and you can download all of the research there. Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kat.
Thanks, Kat.